Hi, my name is City Councillor Nadeem Mazen. We're going to start a process of wrapping up and recapping city meetings that are either really long and need a summary or just aren't televised. Recently we had this excellent City Council meeting, planning board kind of joint get-together, and there were some interesting revelations, a lot of talk about how the planning board has done an excellent job just as volunteers. About how they're kind of a quasi-judicial body that has guidelines and rules that both the City Council needs to help set and that they set for themselves. And there was also a kind of interesting revelation from Assistant City Manager and Head of Community Development, Brian Murphy, that all the work that's gone into Central Square and to some extent Kendall Square planning was to be unveiled piecemeal. Not as an entire planning effort that the entire square can begin at once at the same time, but really when individual developers would come forward that we would just develop the proposal around that one piece or around the next piece after it. What's precipitated this is the Twining proposal for the intersection of Mass Ave and Main Street. I think a lot of people are really frustrated with that. Developers, I think, some developers in Central Square and some business association members are wondering what the point of planning is if you do it piecemeal rather than holistically. And even a lot of neighborhood members, those for development, those against development, think that you can't really meaningfully understand what is to come if you don't have the entire plan in place at the same time. So I think the goal of many of the councilors now is to work with community development. I, in fact, asked at that meeting, how can we find a leader between council and between community development to advance this project? We really need that leadership, especially from community development, so that we as councilors can understand how we can track our policy to the steps that they need to see for implementation. It can either be on us and we can advance infinite policy orders and wait, or it can be on them and they can tell us what the regular schedule of events must be, and we can go through it and get to it much faster and in a more orderly way. A few things that I'm really interested in is giving the planning board more negotiating power. They need to be able to say no. They need to be able to say no when something isn't right. It isn't right holistically. It isn't right for the neighborhood. Neighborhood needs more input, something that planning board really agreed upon and advanced themselves. Between neighborhood input and between giving the planning board some negotiating leverage, we're going to get better projects out of developers. Not to say, how can we make the best experience for our residents, but also, how can we get the city to develop infrastructure that's much needed? How can we do traffic mitigation? How can we share resources like meeting spaces, civic engagement, exercises, swimming pools, basic things that need to be shared to make a neighborhood livable. Ground floor retail, any host of other things that get left out if you just plan building by building and you just yes people. You send them through a process where they know that every step will be a yes for development. We need to be able to say no so that we can get to the best outcome, not to shut projects down, but so that we can get the best revisions coming back as a response to no, so that we can get to yes and to get to a yes that everyone's more comfortable with and everyone benefits from more directly. I also think we need to see a conversation around equity. Something I mentioned in the planning board that is somewhat unpopular is that affordable housing is a good solution, inclusionary affordable housing is a good solution because we need it. We need it at all costs. We also need moderate income housing, and we need that to enter into any of our market rate developments. But if we're going to be equitable about it, it has to be a third, a third, a third. If we do 80% market rate and 20% affordable, or as the case is now, closer to 10% affordable, we're talking about an inequitable situation where you're coming into a neighborhood that may traditionally be lower than market rate. It may even be an underserved neighborhood. And you're saying, as a developer or as a community, let's bring in thousands of people who are very wealthy and some people who are living, at or near the poverty line or at moderate income. And that disparity, just the sheer number coming into new developments, means that it's not going to be an equitable situation. We absolutely must achieve 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or we as a city must find ways to buy property and to create our own public housing mixed income options in lieu of just waiting for developers to solve our problems. So what I'm saying, and I think what many others are saying, is if we want to arrive at a neighborhood that is diverse and a neighborhood that is fair and just, We cannot simply wait for developers to solve our affordable housing problems. We can count the number of units they've brought, but we all too often fail to count the number of market rate units that change that neighborhood and change it in a way that isn't always equitable. Lastly, some planning board members mentioned that planning doesn't have to be holistic. Buildings don't have to reflect one another aesthetically. And while that may be, I'm not talking, when I talk about holistic planning and context, I'm not talking about reflecting one another, buildings reflecting one another. I'm talking about connection. I'm talking about buildings that are actually able to come together, property owners and developers that are able to come together for the real benefit of a community. If you have 8 new buildings and there's no ground floor retail, there's no nightlife, there's no discussion about emerging infrastructure or traffic, you absolutely miss out on the connection aspect. And what you end up having is a lot of people who flow into a new neighborhood, and it happens bereft of a conversation on art, on culture, on community, on education, on fairness. And that is where the context is important, and that is where the planning board should have some say. Or if the planning board doesn't want, as a volunteer board doesn't want or shouldn't have that responsibility, we need to know who on council, who in our neighborhoods, or who in city community development is actually leading those efforts for contextual planning. And we need those leadership moments to have timelines. We need to have those leadership moments to have discussions and documents that are published and agreed upon. And that doesn't always fall out of the zoning the way that we'd like it to. Just because we set zoning in a place like Alewife and say we want industrial to become residential as councilors doesn't mean it becomes the kind of residential that we planned for. And we really, really need more transparency and I think more leadership and more clarity from our urban planners in order to, as councilors and as residents, be sure that we are getting everything that we had hoped for and everything that we had been promised. So that's my wrap up for today. We'll have more of these wrap-ups as we go. Certainly this hasn't been an exhaustive treatment of that meeting, but those were the highlights that I think will be important for us to achieve in Equitable Cambridge.